Hi, I'm Jessica Law, engineering geologist with the Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Board. I will be going over Step 3 of the Supplemental Vapor Intrusion Guidance, which covers the indoor air investigation portion. The image on the left is just a snapshot of the flow chart that is at the beginning of the supplemental guidance that covers those key points within Step 3. It is a great quick reference guide for the various steps within Step 3, Indoor Air Investigation. To start off, I just want to briefly cover the changes that were made to Step 3 in regards to the public comments that were received during the public comment period on the draft guidance. There were two generalized public comments received. The first one was conducting sampling with the ventilation system off can be uncomfortable or unsafe. And the revision that was made to the Supplemental Vapor Intrusion Guidance was it was revised to indicate that sampling under this condition should only be conducted when safe and feasible, and other alternatives are mentioned in the supplemental guidance. The next generalized public comment that was received is the conceptual site model should be the primary tool to determine the appropriate number of samples for the indoor air investigation. There was no change to the supplemental guidance because the text already indicates that the results of the building survey should be used to design the number and location of samples for the indoor air investigation. Now I want to move on to the various steps within the supplemental guidance for Step 3. The first step, Step 3A, is public participation. Public participation should be considered early and often throughout the project lifecycle, and this step is just highlighting public participation from an indoor air sampling point. The primary objective here is to create open communication to clearly explain what to expect and to address concerns. This can improve credibility. It will help reduce delays and receive broader public support, which should lead to a cooperative working relationship with stakeholders. It is important to acknowledge, evaluate, and address concerns throughout the investigation, evaluation, and if necessary, mitigation process. It's important to be flexible with owners and occupants when looking for indoor air sources, placing sampling equipment, and installing subslab probes. Next for the indoor air investigation step is Step 3B, which is conducting an in-depth evaluation of the building. To do this, you would want to use the building survey form, which can be found in Attachment 6 of the Supplemental Vapor Intrusion Guidance. The survey includes visually examining the building inside and out, as well as the surrounding area. The survey also includes reviewing the building layout and drawings, interviewing occupants, and conducting field screening. The survey should be documented on the building survey form and included within the report that's documenting the indoor air sampling activities. This building survey will support development of a conceptual understanding of how vapor intrusion may be occurring at the building. The building survey assists and supports the design of a building-specific sampling plan. It will support the identification and addressing of indoor air sources of vapor-forming chemicals and can help with the interpretation of those indoor air sampling results. The more complete that the building survey form is, the stronger conceptual understanding that you will have and a better interpretation of those sampling results. Next is Step 3C, which is evaluating the spatial distribution of contamination inside and beneath the building. First off, it is important to have those co-located indoor air and subslab sampling locations where you have the location of people, where there are slab penetrations, and in the areas of suspected highest concentrations. It is important to start with 3+ locations based on, again, that building survey that was conducted in the previous step and having those outdoor ambient air sample locations. Then there are additional lines of evidence, which can be your differential pressure measurements, exterior soil gas sampling, vapor conduit sampling, vapor entry point air sampling, whatever additional information that can help support this vapor intrusion evaluation. The next step is 3D, which is assessing risk using those maximum indoor air and subslab soil gas concentrations. First, we want to determine if vapor intrusion is occurring by evaluating the indoor air results with all available lines of evidence. You want to compare the subsurface concentrations to the indoor air sampling results. Does your site have any indicator chemicals detected in the subsurface and indoor air to assist in that evaluation? Evaluating the outdoor air results. Is there the presence of an indoor air source that is not found in the subsurface? What are the vapor conduit air results or the vapor entry point results? Now, if vapor intrusion is determined in the first round of sampling, the maximum measured indoor air concentration should be used for estimating risk and hazard. Now, if risk is calculated to be greater than the point of departure, that 1 times 10 to the minus 6, or the hazard index is greater than 1, you want to manage the exposure. Risk management is discussed more in step 4, but it is important if vapor intrusion is identified to go ahead and manage that exposure. Now, if the estimated risk is less than the point of departure, being that 1 times 10 to the minus 6, and the hazard index is less than 1, then you want to repeat the indoor air sampling event in different seasons, making sure there are 2+ indoor air sampling events, including the HVAC on and off scenarios conducted when feasible, to confirm the building is a low priority building for current vapor intrusion. If there are multiple contaminants of concern, it is important to assess that cumulative risk as well. Even if the indoor air concentrations are low, estimating potential future risk using the subsurface data is important because changes to the site or building conditions over time may increase vapor intrusion and the indoor air concentrations. Next, I want to cover step 3E, which is evaluating temporal variability. This step is just repeating step 3C, but the goal of step 3E is to understand the variability of indoor air concentrations over different seasons, meteorological, and ventilation conditions. To help demonstrate the wide range in temporal variability in indoor air, this graph that was also shown earlier in this training in the vapor intrusion basics section shows the TCE concentrations from roughly 8,000 samples that were collected at the Sun Devil Manor residence. And these samples were collected over a 2.5+ year period under natural conditions. The data shows significant concentration variations between seasons, but also in a single day. Additionally, there was much greater concentration variations during the winter months versus those observed during the spring months. Now, we have stated it is important to evaluate HVAC on and off conditions, but as noted, the HVAC off sampling should only be conducted when it is safe and feasible to do so. Now, if the conceptual site model is robust and supported by multiple lines of evidence, 2 sampling events, including that HVAC assessment, may be sufficient to evaluate that temporal variability. But to make this decision, there are conditions that really should be met. This includes the indoor air sampling events were conducted in different seasons. The subsurface vapor-forming chemicals are either not detected in indoor air samples, or the cumulative risk and hazard associated with those detected concentrations are consistently below the points of departure, those risk threshold values. And there are no other indications of vapor intrusion. such as elevated concentrations detected in pathway samples. Additionally, the subsurface data demonstrates that contaminant concentrations are stable or decreasing across multiple sampling events. Now, if those conditions are not met, additional sampling events should be conducted to further evaluate that temporal variability to ensure that there are those supporting lines of evidence that the building was sufficiently evaluated. The final step is step 3F, determining those next steps. The next steps that should be based on all available lines of evidence. When you are looking at your current vapor intrusion risk, you want to estimate risk and hazard using those indoor air concentrations. Now, this is that final step, and you have collected, your multiple indoor air samples. They have been collected in different seasons. You have had HVAC on and off sampling scenarios. And if your risk is less than 1 × 10⁻⁶, and your hazard index is less than 1, the building would be considered a low vapor intrusion priority building, and you would want to reevaluate it in the future if conditions change. And those conditions and that kind of scenario of changing conditions is discussed further in step 4B.1. Now, if your risk is greater than 10⁻⁶ or your hazard index is greater than 1, you want to manage those exposures, and managing the exposure is discussed in further detail in step 4, and that is going to be talked on next. Now, another scenario would be that future building, the one that doesn't exist or is going to be demoed and rebuilt, and for those future occupants. Now, in that case, you want to evaluate your subsurface lines of evidence to determine that potential vapor intrusion risk. So in that scenario, again, if your risk from the subsurface samples are less than 1 × 10⁻⁶, and your hazard index is less than 1, it would be considered a low future vapor intrusion priority building. Again, that is after a couple of sampling events. You don't want to make that determination based on one sampling event. If risk is greater than 1 × 10⁻⁶, or your hazard index is greater than 1, you are going to want to look to manage that exposure. And what and how to manage that exposure, that again is step 4 and is discussed further and will look different for each site given those site-specific considerations. And that concludes step 3.